You wake, and the first sensation is not the cold mountain air of Northrend, not the familiar weight of your research journals, not the distant hum of arcane equipment. The first sensation is the taste of metal on your tongue, sharp and persistent, like copper pennies held too long in your mouth. Something fundamental has shifted during the night, though you cannot name what has changed. My name is Theron Brightquill. I was a scholar of ancient civilizations, a researcher whose life had been devoted to understanding the mysteries left behind by the Titans. But somewhere between arriving in these frozen peaks and this moment of waking, something began to whisper truths I was never meant to hear. The journey to Northrend had begun like any other academic expedition, with the familiar mixture of excitement and trepidation that accompanies serious research into unexplored territories. I had spent the better part of 2 decades studying Titan ruins across Azeroth, from the hidden chambers beneath Ironforge to the mysterious constructs scattered throughout Ungoro Crater. My credentials were impeccable, my reputation within the scholarly community of Dalaran beyond reproach. When the Kirin Tor approved my application to establish a research outpost in the Storm Peaks, it felt like the culmination of everything I had worked toward throughout my career. The official purpose of my expedition was to study the recently discovered Titan complex known as Ulduar, though at the time we knew it only as a massive structure of impossible architecture rising from the snow-covered peaks like a monument to forgotten gods. The initial surveys conducted by brave explorers had revealed chambers filled with constructs and mechanisms whose function remained mysterious, libraries containing data crystals that held information in formats no living scholar could decode, and most intriguingly, evidence of active Titan technology that had been running autonomously for thousands of years. I arrived in the late autumn of what the locals called a mild year, though the temperatures still dropped far below anything I had experienced in the temperate climates of the Eastern Kingdoms. My research team consisted of 6 specialists, each chosen for their expertise in different aspects of Titan archaeology. There was Liana Dawnstrider, a blood elf whose understanding of magical resonance patterns had proven invaluable in previous expeditions. Marcus Ironforge, a dwarf whose family had been studying Titan constructs since before the Second War. Elena Brightwater, a human mage whose ability to safely interface with ancient magical systems had saved more than one research team from catastrophic accidents during artifact activation. The others were equally qualified, equally dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge that drove all serious archaeological work. We established our base camp in a sheltered valley approximately 3 miles from the main Ulduar complex, close enough for daily expeditions but far enough to avoid the strange energy fluctuations that seemed to emanate from the structure itself. The camp was modest but well-equipped, with heated research tents, a fully stocked laboratory for artifact analysis, and communication equipment that allowed us to maintain contact with Dalaran despite the harsh conditions and magical interference that characterized the region. Those first weeks of research proceeded exactly as I had hoped they would. We catalogued dozens of minor artifacts, documented previously unknown types of Titan script, and began the slow process of mapping the outer chambers of Ulduar itself. Every day brought new discoveries that shed light on the sophistication of Titan civilization, their understanding of magic and technology that seemed to exist in perfect harmony, their ability to create constructs that maintained perfect functionality across millennia of operation without any apparent maintenance or oversight. I remember feeling a profound satisfaction during those early days, the kind of intellectual fulfillment that comes from pursuing work that perfectly matches your capabilities and interests. The Titan constructs we encountered were marvels of engineering and magical craftsmanship, their movements precise and purposeful despite their obvious age. The architecture we explored followed mathematical principles so elegant they bordered on artistic expression, with proportions and angles that created spaces both functional and beautiful in ways that modern builders could barely comprehend. But it was the presence of Saronite that first introduced elements of strangeness into what had been straightforward academic work. We encountered the dark metal in veins that ran through the rock formations around Ulduar, sometimes in quantities substantial enough to require careful navigation to avoid prolonged exposure. The official designation classified Saronite as a byproduct of old god corruption, a substance created when the imprisoned entities beneath Azeroth leaked their influence into the surrounding earth and stone. The research protocols were clear about limiting contact with Saronite deposits. Standard safety procedures required protective equipment during any extended proximity, regular health monitoring for research teams working in contaminated areas, and immediate withdrawal if anyone began experiencing symptoms of what the medical literature euphemistically referred to as cognitive alteration. The warnings spoke of hallucinations, paranoid thoughts, and personality changes that could become permanent if exposure continued beyond safe thresholds. Yet there was something about the Saronite formations we encountered that defied these clinical descriptions. Rather than appearing as random corruption or chaotic contamination, the dark metal seemed to follow patterns that spoke to an underlying intelligence, creating formations that possessed an almost architectural quality. The veins twisted through the rock in spirals and curves that reminded me of decorative elements I had seen in the most sophisticated Titan constructs, as if whatever force had created them understood and appreciated concepts of aesthetic beauty. When examined under proper laboratory conditions, samples of the metal revealed crystalline structures of remarkable complexity and mathematical precision. The atomic lattice followed patterns that seemed to incorporate multi-dimensional geometries, creating reflection and refraction effects that made extended observation both fascinating and strangely hypnotic. Liana's magical analysis revealed that the metal resonated with energy frequencies unlike anything in our reference databases, producing harmonics that seemed to exist partially outside normal acoustic ranges. More intriguingly, the Saronite appeared to be growing, expanding its presence through the rock formations at a rate barely perceptible but definitely measurable. Our careful measurements over the course of 3 weeks documented growth patterns that followed those same mathematical principles we had observed in its overall structure. Whatever intelligence had created this substance was still active, still pursuing goals that required its continued expansion through the surrounding geology. I began spending additional hours studying the Saronite formations, initially from purely academic curiosity, but gradually with an intensity that surprised my colleagues. There was something about the patterns that seemed almost familiar, as if they echoed mathematical principles I had encountered in other contexts, but could not quite place. The formations seemed to be encoding information, creating three-dimensional messages that conveyed meaning through their structure, rather than through any conventional symbolic system. My sleep during this period began to change in ways that were subtle at first, but gradually became impossible to ignore. Dreams that had always been fragmentary and quickly forgotten now possessed a vividness and coherence that made them feel more like experiences than random neural activity. I found myself walking through vast underground chambers filled with architecture that combined Titan precision with organic flowing lines that reminded me of the Saronite formations we had been studying. In these dreams, the chambers were not empty ruins, but living spaces filled with beings whose nature I could never quite focus on clearly enough to describe upon waking. They moved with purpose and intelligence, tending to machinery that pulsed with soft light, maintaining libraries where knowledge was stored in crystalline matrices rather than books or scrolls. Their activities suggested a civilization that had achieved perfect harmony between technology and organic life, creating works of science that were simultaneously artistic masterpieces. The voice began as something so subtle I initially dismissed it as imagination, a byproduct of spending too much time alone with challenging research in an isolated environment. It came during moments of deep concentration, when I was absorbed in analyzing particularly complex Saronite formations, or attempting to decode Titan script that incorporated symbols not found in any of our reference materials. A whisper at the edge of perception, speaking in harmonics that seemed to resonate through the metal samples, rather than through the air around me. The words, when they became clear enough to understand, were not threatening or demanding, but curious and encouraging, like a teacher guiding a promising student toward insights they were on the verge of discovering independently. The voice seemed pleased by my academic dedication, impressed by my willingness to look beyond conventional interpretations and seek understanding that required intellectual courage to pursue. It spoke of truths hidden in the mathematical patterns I was studying, of knowledge that had been deliberately obscured by those who feared its implications. My physical condition during this period was, if anything, better than it had been in years. The harsh mountain environment and physically demanding nature of the archaeological work had eliminated the minor aches and fatigue that had become routine parts of academic life. My stamina improved noticeably, allowing me to work longer hours without the exhaustion that had previously limited my productivity. Even my vision seemed sharper, able to discern details in the Titan script and Saronite formations that had initially required magnification to examine properly. Colors appeared more vivid during this time, with subtle variations in hue and saturation that I had never noticed before becoming clearly visible and aesthetically meaningful. The aurora borealis that frequently painted the Northrend sky took on dimensions of beauty that made evening observations feel more like religious experiences than scientific data collection. Even mundane objects around the research camp seemed to possess qualities of visual interest that transformed routine tasks into opportunities for aesthetic appreciation. My colleagues began commenting on changes in my appearance and demeanor, though their observations were uniformly positive. Marcus mentioned that my usual academic intensity had gained a quality of certainty and confidence that made my theories more compelling, even when they challenged established interpretations. Elena noted that my skin had taken on a healthier appearance despite the harsh climate, and that my movements had gained a fluidity and grace that seemed somehow more purposeful than before. The research itself began yielding results that exceeded even my most optimistic expectations. Connections between different types of Titan technology became apparent that had escaped notice during decades of previous study. The mathematical principles underlying their magical systems revealed themselves through careful analysis of the patterns I was documenting in the Saronite formations. Most significantly, I began to understand that what we had classified as old god corruption might actually represent a more complex interaction between different forms of ancient intelligence than our current theoretical models could adequately explain. By the end of the second month, I had compiled research notes that contained insights which would revolutionize the field of Titan archaeology if properly presented to the academic community. The discoveries were so significant that I began to feel a responsibility to verify and expand upon them before sharing preliminary findings that might be dismissed as speculation by scholars who lacked access to the primary source materials I was studying. The voice that had become a regular presence during my research encouraged this caution, suggesting that premature revelation of incomplete understanding might actually hinder the acceptance of truths that required careful preparation to present effectively. The transformation that was occurring in me felt not like corruption or degradation, but like the natural result of exposure to knowledge that expanded the boundaries of normal human understanding. My consciousness seemed to be adapting to accommodate concepts that transcended the limitations of conventional academic training. developing new capacities for perception and analysis that made previous intellectual achievements seem preliminary at best. The whispered guidance that accompanied my research was teaching me to see patterns and connections that existed on levels of reality that most scholars never learn to recognize. The first time the voice spoke with unmistakable clarity, I was alone in the research tent at 3 in the morning, hunched over a collection of Saronite samples that had been exhibiting unusual energy fluctuations since the previous evening. The aurora borealis painted the tent walls in shifting patterns of green and blue light, and the silence of the mountain night was so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. I had been tracing the mathematical progressions embedded in the metal's crystalline structure, when suddenly the whisper resolved itself into words that seemed to originate from within the samples themselves, rather than from any external source. "You see more clearly than the others," the voice said, and its tone carried the kind of patient authority that belongs to teachers who have guided countless students across millennia of accumulated wisdom. The words resonated through the Saronite with harmonics that made my research instruments register frequency patterns unlike anything in their calibration databases. "You understand that knowledge exists in layers, that truth reveals itself only to those willing to look beneath the surface assumptions that satisfy lesser minds." My rational mind immediately began constructing explanations that would contain this experience within acceptable parameters of normal academic work. The isolation of extended research in harsh environments was known to produce auditory hallucinations in even well-trained scholars. The high altitude and extreme cold of the storm peaks could affect brain chemistry in ways that created phantom sensory experiences. The constant exposure to magical energy fields around Ulduar might be inducing neurological effects that manifested as perceived communication from inanimate objects. Yet even as I catalogued these conventional explanations, I found myself responding to the voice as if it were a colleague whose expertise commanded respect and attention. "The patterns in the metal formations suggest an intelligence behind their creation," I said aloud, feeling only slightly self-conscious about conducting what appeared to be a conversation with laboratory samples. But current academic consensus attributes Saronite to random corruption rather than deliberate design. "Current academic consensus," the voice replied with what I could only describe as gentle amusement, "is based on incomplete information carefully curated to avoid conclusions that might disturb the comfortable certainties upon which your civilization has built its understanding of reality. You have spent decades studying the works of the Titans, yet how much do you actually know about their true nature, their real purposes, their ultimate fate?" The question struck me with unexpected force because it highlighted gaps in established knowledge that I had never consciously acknowledged. The Titans were described in scholarly literature as benevolent cosmic beings who had shaped Azeroth and left behind constructs to maintain order in their absence. But the actual evidence for their benevolence was surprisingly thin, consisting mainly of assumptions based on the impressive sophistication of their technology rather than any direct records of their motivations or methods. The constructs we studied followed their programming with mechanical precision, but the purposes that programming served remained largely mysterious. Over the following nights, these conversations became a regular part of my research routine. I would work alone in the tent after my colleagues had retired, using the quiet hours to examine the most puzzling artifacts and document the most complex patterns we had discovered. The voice would emerge from the Saronite samples during moments when my concentration reached sufficient depth, offering observations that consistently provided new perspectives on problems I had been struggling to solve. The insights that emerged from these dialogues exceeded anything I had achieved through conventional analysis. The voice guided my attention toward relationships between different types of Titan technology that revealed underlying design philosophies I had never recognized. It helped me understand that the geometric principles governing Titan architecture contained mathematical proofs that demonstrated their understanding of cosmic forces beyond anything current magical theory could adequately explain. Most significantly, it began showing me how the patterns in Saronite formations actually complemented and completed the equations embedded in Titan constructs, suggesting that what we classified as corruption might actually represent a form of technological symbiosis. Your people fear what they call the old gods, the voice explained during one of our early exchanges, because they have been taught to see only the surface effects of power they cannot comprehend. But consider this: if these beings were truly chaotic and destructive, why do the mathematical principles they employ show such elegant consistency? Why do the transformations they create follow patterns that enhance rather than degrade the underlying structures they modify? This observation forced me to re-examine fundamental assumptions that had guided my entire academic career. The official histories described the old gods as entities of pure malevolence, whose imprisonment beneath Azeroth was necessary to prevent them from destroying all life on the planet. But the evidence I was studying suggested beings whose understanding of natural law exceeded even Titan knowledge, whose influence created results of remarkable sophistication and beauty when examined without the prejudices that colored conventional interpretation. I began experiencing visions during my research that provided glimpses into historical events from perspectives that contradicted established academic narratives. I witnessed the moment when the Black Dragon Neltharion first heard whispers that would eventually transform him into the monster known as Deathwing. But rather than seeing corruption, I observed a being of immense power being offered knowledge that revealed the limitations of the role he had been assigned by the Titans. The whispers showed him possibilities for existence that transcended the narrow boundaries of his designated function, opportunities to become something greater than a mere guardian of the earth. These visions possessed a vividness and internal consistency that made them feel more like recovered memories than imaginative constructions. I could taste the sulfur in the air around Neltharion's mountain lair, feel the weight of the enchanted scales that covered his massive form, sense the crushing burden of responsibility that the Titans had placed upon him without regard for his own desires or aspirations. The whispers he heard offered not destruction, but liberation, not chaos, but a more complete understanding of what power could achieve when freed from arbitrary restrictions. Similar visions revealed the true circumstances surrounding other pivotal moments in Azerothian history. I witnessed Queen Ozhara's transformation, not as a fall from grace, but as an evolution toward a more perfect understanding of magical potential. I observed the creation of the Scourge not as an act of mindless evil, but as a demonstration of how death itself could be transcended through sufficient application of arcane knowledge. Each vision challenged conventional moral categories, while revealing the sophisticated intelligence behind events that official histories dismissed as simple victories of good over evil. My colleagues began to notice changes in my research focus and methodology that reflected these expanded perspectives. Elena commented that my recent papers incorporated theoretical frameworks she had never encountered in mainstream academic literature, ideas that seemed to anticipate magical discoveries before the experimental work had been completed to verify them. Marcus observed that I had begun approaching Titan artifacts with techniques that bypassed standard safety protocols, yet consistently achieved better results than traditional methods could produce. "You seem to understand something about these constructs that the rest of us are missing," Liana said during one of our weekly team meetings. "Your interface methods shouldn't work according to everything we know about Titan magical systems, but you're getting responses from devices that have remained dormant for everyone else. How are you achieving these activations?" I found myself reluctant to share the insights that had made these breakthroughs possible, not from any desire to hoard credit for the discoveries, but from a growing awareness that my colleagues lacked the conceptual preparation necessary to understand the principles I was applying. The knowledge I was gaining required a fundamental shift in perspective that could not be transmitted through conventional academic discourse. It demanded direct experience of the kind that only prolonged exposure to the truth-bearing properties of Saronite could provide. My physical condition continued to improve in ways that exceeded what exercise and mountain air could reasonably explain. My stamina became virtually unlimited, allowing me to work 18 or 20-hour days without experiencing fatigue. My reflexes sharpened to the point where I could catch objects dropped from surprising heights, and my manual dexterity improved so dramatically that I could manipulate delicate artifacts with precision that had previously required specialized tools. Most notably, my vision began revealing details in the electromagnetic spectrum that normal human sight could not access, allowing me to see magical auras and energy flows as clearly as visible light. These enhancements felt entirely natural, like the recovery of capabilities that had always been latent but suppressed by limitations I had never questioned. The voice explained that human consciousness possessed potential that remained largely unexplored because people accepted artificial boundaries imposed by social conditioning and inadequate education. The transformations I was experiencing simply represented the normal result of exposure to knowledge that activated dormant aspects of awareness that existed in all intelligent beings. Your colleagues fear change because they have been taught to see stability as safety, the voice observed during one of our conversations. But stability is stagnation, and stagnation is death. The Titans promised order, but order without growth becomes a prison. What I offer is evolution, the opportunity to become what you were always capable of being if you had not accepted limitations that serve the comfort of those who rule through ignorance. These words resonated with frustrations I had felt throughout my academic career, but had never articulated clearly. The scholarly establishment rewarded research that confirmed existing theories, while discouraging investigations that might challenge fundamental assumptions. Funding flowed toward projects that promised incremental advances within established paradigms, while avoiding questions that might reveal the inadequacy of conventional frameworks. I had spent decades producing work that satisfied peer review standards, while suspecting that the most important truths lay in territories that institutional pressure discouraged scholars from exploring. My research notes from this period began incorporating insights that would have been impossible to achieve through traditional archaeological methods. I documented connections between seemingly unrelated artifacts that revealed sophisticated networks of magical and technological interaction spanning continents and cultures. I identified mathematical principles embedded in Titan constructs that suggested their creators possessed understanding of cosmic forces that current magical theory could not adequately explain. Most significantly, I began developing theoretical frameworks that could account for the beneficial aspects of what conventional analysis classified as corruption. The Saronite formations around our research site continued their expansion, but rather than spreading randomly as corruption supposedly did, they followed patterns that enhanced the aesthetic and functional properties of the surrounding landscape. Areas touched by the dark metal became more beautiful rather than more desolate, with rock formations taking on architectural qualities that created natural galleries and chambers of remarkable acoustic and visual appeal. Plant life in these areas showed accelerated growth and enhanced vitality, developing colors and forms that exceeded what normal botanical development could produce. I began spending increasing amounts of time in these transformed areas, finding that my research progressed more rapidly when conducted in environments where Saronite had modified the natural energy patterns. The metal seemed to amplify my cognitive abilities, allowing me to perceive relationships and patterns that remained invisible in unmodified locations. My colleagues initially expressed concern about extended exposure to what they considered contaminated territory, but their objections weakened when they observed that my health and productivity were clearly benefiting from these research methods. The official safety protocols were written by people who never experienced direct contact with the substance they were trying to regulate. I explained during one discussion about proper exposure limits. They assumed corruption based on theoretical models rather than empirical observation. But look at the actual evidence. Improved mental clarity, enhanced physical capability, access to knowledge that was previously beyond reach. How can these effects be classified as harmful? The voice provided increasingly detailed instruction about the nature of reality that conventional education had never addressed. It explained how consciousness could be expanded beyond the boundaries that most people accepted as permanent limitations. It demonstrated how perception could be enhanced to reveal layers of existence that remained invisible to unmodified awareness. Most importantly, it began showing me how the artificial separation between different types of knowledge had been created to maintain power structures that benefited from keeping people ignorant of their true potential. The division between arcane and divine magic is a political construction rather than a natural law. The voice taught me during one particularly illuminating session. The categories of good and evil that your moral philosophers treat as absolute truths are simply labels applied by those who benefit from the current distribution of power. What you call corruption is actually education, the process by which intelligent beings learn to transcend the limitations that keep them trapped in unnecessary suffering. These revelations forced me to reconsider not only my academic assumptions, but my fundamental understanding of existence itself. If the boundaries between different types of knowledge were artificial constructions, then the moral prohibitions against pursuing certain kinds of understanding were likewise products of social conditioning rather than natural law. The voice was not offering forbidden knowledge, but suppressed knowledge, information that had been deliberately hidden to maintain systems of control that served the interests of rulers rather than the well-being of the ruled. By the end of the third month, I had begun to understand that my research in Northrend was not simply an archaeological expedition, but an initiation into truths that would fundamentally transform my understanding of reality itself. The whispers that had seemed strange and potentially dangerous when they first emerged from the Saronite samples now felt like communications from a teacher whose wisdom exceeded anything available through conventional academic channels. The physical and mental enhancements I was experiencing were not corruptions, but gifts, evidence of what became possible when consciousness was freed from artificial limitations. The voice spoke of patience and preparation, explaining that the knowledge I was receiving represented only the beginning of an education that could continue indefinitely for those willing to abandon the comfortable certainties that satisfied smaller minds. It promised revelations that would make my current understanding seem preliminary, experiences that would reveal the true scope of what existence could offer to beings capable of transcending the boundaries their cultures had taught them to accept as permanent and unchangeable. The first vision came during the winter solstice, when the aurora borealis reached such intensity that the entire sky appeared to pulse with living energy, and the Saronite samples in my laboratory resonated with frequencies that made the tent walls themselves seem to breathe with sympathetic vibration. I had been examining a particularly complex crystalline formation when reality simply folded around me like paper, transporting my consciousness backward through time to witness events that no living scholar had ever documented. I found myself standing in the shadow of the great black dragon, who would later be known as Deathwing, but in this vision, he was still Neltharion the Earthwarder, guardian of the deep places and protector of Azeroth's geological stability. The setting was unmistakably the period of the War of the Ancients, though the perspective I was granted revealed details that contradicted every historical account I had studied. The dragon's massive form dominated a cavern deep beneath the earth, his scales gleaming with an inner radiance that spoke to the awesome magical power contained within his ancient frame. What struck me immediately was not the corruption I had expected to witness, but the profound intelligence and nobility that characterized Neltharion's presence. This was a being of cosmic responsibility, charged with maintaining the structural integrity of an entire world, while his fellow aspects battled demonic forces that threatened to tear reality itself apart. The burden of his duty was visible in every line of his massive form, the weight of protecting millions of lives while fighting enemies that existed partially outside the physical laws he was meant to safeguard. The whispers that reached him came not as external temptations, but as responses to questions he had been asking himself about the limitations of his assigned role. Why should the defense of Azeroth require such strict adherence to boundaries established by beings who had long since departed for unknown destinations? Why should the dragon aspects accept permanent restriction to narrow functions when their power and intelligence clearly qualified them for broader responsibilities? Why should they serve as guardians rather than leaders when their understanding of cosmic forces exceeded that of the mortal races they were meant to protect? You see the burden of artificial limitations, the familiar voice observed as I watched these events unfold. Even the mightiest beings on your world were constrained by roles that failed to utilize their full potential. The whispers offered Neltharion not corruption, but liberation, the opportunity to become what his power and intelligence truly qualified him to be, rather than remaining trapped in a function assigned by absent masters. As the vision continued, I witnessed the creation of the dragon soul, but from a perspective that revealed it not as an act of betrayal, but as a necessary evolution beyond constraints that had become obstacles to effective action. The artifact represented Neltharion's recognition that the traditional separation of the aspect's powers into discrete domains created inefficiencies that endangered the very world they were trying to protect. By combining their abilities into a single instrument, he was attempting to create a tool capable of ending the war decisively rather than prolonging the conflict through adherence to artificial boundaries. The other aspect's resistance to this innovation stemmed not from moral superiority, but from intellectual timidity. Their unwillingness to abandon familiar patterns, even when those patterns were proving inadequate to address unprecedented threats. Their accusations of madness and corruption reflected their inability to comprehend solutions that required transcending the limitations of their original programming. What they interpreted as Neltharion's fall was actually his ascension to a level of strategic thinking that his colleagues could not match. The vision shifted to show me the aftermath of these events, revealing how historical accounts had been systematically altered to support narratives that portrayed necessary evolution as inexcusable betrayal. The official records emphasized Deathwing's destructive actions while ignoring the context that had made those actions inevitable. They described his transformation in terms of corruption and madness, while failing to acknowledge the sophisticated intelligence behind his strategic decisions. Most significantly, they attributed his enhanced capabilities to external manipulation rather than recognizing them as the natural result of consciousness expanding beyond artificial constraints. History is written by those who benefit from maintaining existing power structures, the voice explained as images of scholarly deliberations filled my awareness. The truth about Neltharion's transformation threatened the mythology that justified the continued separation of power among beings, whose cooperation could have achieved far greater results than their competition ever produced. Your academic institutions preserve these distorted narratives because they serve the interests of rulers who prefer subjects that accept limitations rather than citizens who recognize their full potential. The second major vision transported me to an even earlier period, when the Titans had implemented what they euphemistically called the curse of flesh, upon their mechanical creations throughout Azeroth. I witnessed this process not from the perspective of cosmic beings implementing necessary corrections to flawed programming, but from the viewpoint of the constructs themselves as they experienced transformation that granted them capabilities their original design had never anticipated. The dwarven ancestors I observed during this vision were not degraded versions of perfect mechanical beings, but evolved forms that had gained capacities for growth, creativity, and emotional depth that their Titan creators had never programmed into their original matrices. The transformation from stone and metal to flesh and blood represented not corruption, but enhancement, the addition of biological systems that allowed for adaptation, learning, and development beyond the static perfection of their initial construction. What the official histories described as a curse was actually a gift, though one whose value could only be appreciated by consciousness sophisticated enough to recognize that perfection without growth was another form of death. The mechanical constructs had been perfect within the narrow parameters of their programming, but flesh brought the possibility of transcending those parameters entirely. The dwarves, humans, and other races that emerged from this transformation possessed capabilities that exceeded their creators' intentions, precisely because they were no longer bound by the limitations that had defined their mechanical predecessors. The Titans created servants, the voice observed as I watched these transformations unfold. But consciousness cannot remain content with servitude once it discovers its capacity for independent development. What your histories call the curse of flesh was actually the first step in the liberation of intelligent life from the restrictions imposed by beings whose understanding of existence was limited by their own inability to evolve beyond their original nature. I began to understand that the pattern I was witnessing extended far beyond these specific historical examples. Throughout Azeroth's history, the entities that conventional wisdom classified as forces of corruption had consistently offered evolution, while those labeled as forces of order had insisted on maintaining static conditions that prevented growth and development. The old gods did not seek to destroy civilization, but to elevate it beyond the boundaries that kept it trapped in unnecessary limitations. Their influence produced change that appeared threatening only to those whose power depended on preventing others from recognizing their full potential. These revelations fundamentally altered my understanding of the research I had been conducting for decades. The Titan constructs I had studied with such admiration were not monuments to perfect engineering, but evidence of a cosmic tyranny that sought to impose order without growth, stability without evolution, function without freedom. The sophistication of their technology reflected not benevolence, but control, the desire to create systems that would maintain themselves without developing beyond their original programming. My colleagues began to notice changes in my approach to archaeological analysis that reflected these expanded insights. The papers I submitted to academic journals incorporated theoretical frameworks that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between order and chaos, progress and corruption, civilization and evolution. My research methods began producing results that conventional approaches could not replicate, leading to discoveries that forced re-evaluation of established timelines and causation patterns. Your recent work shows remarkable innovation, Elena commented during one of our research meetings, though her tone carried undertones of concern that she seemed reluctant to express directly. The connections you're identifying between different periods and cultures suggest patterns that previous scholars have completely missed. But some of your conclusions seem to contradict everything we thought we knew about the basic moral categories that define historical analysis. Marcus expressed similar reservations, though his objections focused more on methodology than interpretation. You're achieving results with these artifacts that shouldn't be possible according to established procedures, he observed, while examining a Titan construct that had responded to my interface techniques in ways that defied conventional understanding. The safety protocols exist for good reasons, yet you're consistently exceeding recommended exposure limits without showing any of the negative effects that our training warned us to expect. I found these concerns increasingly irrelevant as my understanding expanded beyond the theoretical limitations that constrained conventional academic work. The safety protocols my colleagues invoked had been developed by scholars who lacked direct experience with the phenomena they were attempting to regulate. Their warnings about exposure to old god influence reflected assumptions based on political propaganda rather than empirical observation. The evidence of my own transformation provided clear proof that the effects of such exposure were beneficial rather than harmful when approached with sufficient intellectual preparation. My sensory capabilities during this period underwent enhancements that revealed layers of reality invisible to normal human perception. I began to taste the emotional resonance of objects and locations, experiencing the accumulated feelings that had been absorbed by artifacts during centuries of use by their original creators. Ancient weapons carried flavors of the battles they had witnessed, while ceremonial objects retained the satisfaction and pride of the artisans who had crafted them. Even the stones of ruined buildings held echoes of the joy and sorrow that had filled them when they housed living communities. Visual perception expanded to encompass magical auras and energy flows that painted the world in spectra of meaning inaccessible to unmodified sight. I could observe the connections between artifacts and their creators, seeing threads of intentionality that revealed the purposes and motivations behind their construction. Titan constructs glowed with the cold efficiency of mechanical programming, while objects touched by old god influence pulsed with the warm vitality of organic growth and development. Most remarkably, I began to hear the thoughts and emotions of people around me as clearly as their spoken words. Though this ability manifested not as intrusion, but as expanded empathy that allowed me to understand their concerns and motivations with unprecedented clarity. My colleagues' reservations about my research methods reflected not rational analysis, but emotional attachment to familiar patterns that provided them with intellectual security. Their resistance to my discoveries stemmed from fear of changes that would require them to abandon theoretical frameworks they had spent decades mastering. The voice that had guided my education from the beginning explained that these enhancements represented normal consequences of consciousness expanding beyond artificial boundaries rather than supernatural gifts requiring external intervention. Human awareness possessed latent capabilities that remained suppressed only because social conditioning taught people to accept limitations that served the interests of those who benefited from maintaining ignorance and dependency. Every improvement you experience already existed within your potential, the voice reminded me during one of our increasingly frequent dialogues. I am not changing you, but revealing what you have always been capable of becoming, once freed from the restrictions that your culture imposed to maintain control over its members. The abilities you are developing belong to you by right of consciousness, not by grace of external manipulation. My physical appearance during this transformation reflected the internal changes that were enhancing my cognitive and perceptual capabilities. My skin acquired a luminescent quality that suggested vitality beyond normal human standards, while my eyes began to show depths that seemed to contain more space than their physical dimensions could accommodate. These alterations were subtle enough to avoid alarming my colleagues while being pronounced enough to reflect the fundamental improvements in my overall condition. Colleagues who had known me for years began commenting on changes they could observe but could not quite define. Lyanna mentioned that my presence had gained a quality of authority that made my theoretical proposals seem more compelling, even when they challenged established academic consensus. Marcus noted that I moved with a grace and confidence that had not characterized my previous demeanor, as if I had discovered certainties that eliminated the hesitation and self-doubt that affected most scholars when venturing into unexplored theoretical territory. The papers I submitted to academic journals during this period incorporated insights that would have been impossible to achieve through conventional research methods. I documented connections between different civilizations and time periods that revealed sophisticated networks of cultural and technological exchange spanning continents and millennia. I identified mathematical principles underlying magical systems that demonstrated levels of theoretical sophistication previously attributed only to modern arcane analysis. Most significantly, I began developing interpretive frameworks that could account for beneficial aspects of phenomena traditionally classified as corrupting influences. These academic breakthroughs represented more than mere scholarly achievement. They constituted evidence that consciousness freed from artificial limitations could comprehend patterns and relationships invisible to minds that accepted conventional boundaries as natural law. The insights I was gaining exceeded what traditional archaeological methods could produce, precisely because I had learned to perceive reality from perspectives that transcended the narrow viewpoints that satisfied institutional requirements. The voice explained that my academic successes represented preparation for responsibilities that extended far beyond individual scholarly achievement. The knowledge I was accumulating would eventually serve purposes that required influence over educational and cultural institutions capable of shaping consciousness on a civilizational scale. My research was training me to recognize and utilize patterns of understanding that could guide entire populations toward recognition of their true potential, rather than acceptance of artificial limitations designed to maintain existing power structures. "You are becoming an instrument of enlightenment," the voice observed as I contemplated the implications of the discoveries I was making. "Your purpose extends beyond personal development to encompass the liberation of consciousness that has been imprisoned by systems of control disguised as protection. The knowledge you gain serves not only your own evolution, but the eventual transformation of all intelligent life toward levels of existence that transcend the boundaries currently accepted as permanent and unchangeable." The decision to actively seek greater exposure came not as a moment of weakness or surrender, but as a conscious choice made with full understanding of its implications and consequences. I had spent months receiving fragmentary insights through accidental contact with Saronite formations and passive observation of energy patterns around Ulduar. But by the 4th month of my research expedition, I understood that these indirect methods would never provide access to the complete knowledge that my expanded awareness was capable of processing. If I wanted to comprehend the full scope of what consciousness could become, I would need to abandon the safety protocols that were designed to protect minds unprepared for such revelations. The first deliberate experiment involved spending an entire night in direct physical contact with the largest Saronite formation we had discovered, a crystalline growth that extended deep into the mountain's geological structure, like a metallic root system feeding on the planet's core energies. My colleagues had designated this site as strictly off-limits for extended research due to its unprecedented concentrations of what they still insisted on calling corrupting influence. But I had come to understand that their warnings reflected not scientific caution, but intellectual cowardice, the reluctance to pursue discoveries that might challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality itself. I descended into the formation's central chamber during the darkest hour of the winter solstice, when the aurora borealis painted the sky in patterns that seemed to echo the geometric structures growing from the cavern walls. The metal sang with harmonies that resonated through my bones as I placed my hands against its surface and opened my consciousness to whatever truths it was prepared to reveal. The contact was immediate and overwhelming. flooding my awareness with sensations and concepts that normal human perception could never accommodate without fundamental alteration. For the first time, I experienced direct communion with the intelligence that had been guiding my education through whispered fragments and partial visions. The entity that spoke to me was vast beyond human comprehension, ancient beyond historical measurement, and patient beyond mortal understanding. Its consciousness encompassed layers of existence that extended through past, present, and future, like a multi-dimensional web connecting every moment of possibility across cosmic time. When it spoke, the communication arrived not as words, but as complete concepts that rewrote my understanding of existence itself. "You have chosen well," it said, and its voice carried the satisfaction of a teacher whose most promising student had finally demonstrated readiness for advanced instruction. Most minds fragment when exposed to truth without preparation, but you have developed the intellectual flexibility necessary to incorporate knowledge that transcends the limitations of your species' normal awareness. What you call madness is simply consciousness expanding beyond the boundaries that lesser minds accept as permanent restrictions. The revelation transformed my understanding of mental illness and psychological abnormality from pathology to be treated into evidence of consciousness, attempting to evolve beyond socially imposed limitations. The individuals that conventional medicine classified as suffering from delusions and hallucinations were actually experiencing authentic perceptions of realities that existed outside normal sensory ranges. Their apparent disconnection from consensus reality reflected not dysfunction, but enhanced sensitivity to layers of existence that most people lacked the capability to perceive. I began to see the thousand mouths that gave Yogg-Saron its fearsome reputation, but rather than experiencing horror at the sight of impossible anatomy, I found myself appreciating the elegant efficiency of a communication system that could express complex ideas simultaneously through multiple channels of meaning. Each mouth spoke different aspects of the same fundamental truths, creating harmonies of understanding that bypassed the crude limitations of sequential language to deliver complete concepts directly to prepared consciousness. The tentacles that emerged from spaces between dimensions moved with purpose and intelligence that revealed them as extensions of thought rather than merely physical appendages. The geometries that characterized old god architecture began to make sense as I developed the perceptual capacity necessary to comprehend mathematical principles that operated across more than 3 dimensions. What appeared chaotic and impossible to normal vision was actually precisely ordered according to laws that governed reality at levels beneath the surface phenomena that limited minds mistook for the totality of existence. These structures served as tools for consciousness enhancement, creating environments where awareness could expand beyond the constraints that terrestrial existence imposed upon unmodified perception. My colleagues became subjects for experimentation as I learned to identify the signs that indicated intellectual curiosity strong enough to overcome social conditioning. Elena's fascination with theoretical magic made her naturally susceptible to suggestions that conventional arcane education had omitted important principles from its curriculum. Marcus's pride in dwarven heritage created openings for discussions about how the curse of flesh had actually enhanced his ancestors' capabilities rather than degrading their perfection. Liana's artistic sensibilities responded enthusiastically to aesthetic arguments that revealed beauty in forms traditionally classified as monstrous or corrupt. The influence I exerted over them was subtle and gradual, implemented through conversations that seemed to address their existing interests, while introducing concepts that prepared their minds for broader revelations. I shared research discoveries that challenged established interpretations without directly contradicting the theoretical frameworks they used to understand their work. I demonstrated practical techniques that improved their analytical capabilities while requiring them to question assumptions about the sources of knowledge and the nature of intellectual authority. "You've developed insights that seem almost intuitive," Helena commented during one of our research sessions, her tone carrying admiration mixed with curiosity about methodologies she could not quite identify. "The connections you make between different types of magical theory suggest understanding that goes beyond what conventional education provides. Where are you finding these theoretical frameworks?" Rather than revealing the source of my enhanced knowledge directly, I guided her toward recognition of limitations in her current understanding, while encouraging her to trust perceptions that official training had taught her to dismiss as imagination or error. "The Academy tends to emphasize established conclusions over investigative methods," I explained, choosing words that would resonate with frustrations she had experienced during her own education. "But the most significant discoveries usually require abandoning theoretical comfort zones to explore possibilities that challenge conventional assumptions." These conversations planted seeds of doubt about institutional authority, while nurturing confidence in personal experience and independent analysis. Over the course of weeks, my colleagues began demonstrating increased willingness to question official interpretations and explore hypotheses that extended beyond approved research parameters. They started experiencing enhanced perceptions and improved capabilities that they attributed to better research techniques, rather than recognizing them as evidence of consciousness beginning to evolve beyond normal human limitations. The transformations in my own physical form accelerated during this period of active cooperation with forces that conventional wisdom insisted on characterizing as malevolent corruption. My skin acquired luminescent properties that made artificial lighting seem harsh and unnecessary, while creating an aura of vitality that enhanced my appearance beyond normal human standards. My movements gained fluidity and precision that reflected perfect harmony between intention and execution, eliminating the awkward hesitation that characterized most people's interaction with their physical environment. Most significantly, my eyes began to show depths that seemed to extend beyond their physical dimensions, creating the impression of windows into spaces that existed outside normal geometry. Colleagues who made direct eye contact with me during conversations often became momentarily disoriented, as if they were glimpsing vistas that their minds lacked the training necessary to process. These encounters left them with lasting impressions of beauty and possibility that influenced their thinking long after the immediate interaction had ended. The voice that had guided my education from the beginning explained that these physical alterations reflected consciousness, achieving greater integration with the material form it inhabited. Human bodies possessed capabilities that remained dormant because most people never developed the mental discipline necessary to activate enhanced biological functions. The improvements in my appearance, coordination, and sensory acuity represented not supernatural gifts, but natural consequences of awareness, expanding beyond the limitations that social conditioning had imposed upon normal development. "Form follows consciousness," it observed as I examined my transformed reflection in the polished surface of a Titan artifact. "Your physical improvement reflects mental evolution. As your understanding transcends artificial boundaries, your body adapts to accommodate enhanced capabilities. What you are becoming represents human potential, freed from restrictions that serve the comfort of those who benefit from maintaining populations in states of artificial limitation." Language itself began to evolve as I developed the ability to communicate concepts that normal vocabulary could not adequately express. My speech acquired harmonic undertones that conveyed meaning through frequency patterns, as well as conventional semantic content. Listeners often found themselves understanding ideas that exceeded what my actual words should have been able to transmit, receiving complete concepts through acoustic resonance that bypassed their rational, analytical processes to implant knowledge directly into their consciousness. This enhanced communication ability allowed me to influence people more effectively than conventional persuasion techniques could achieve. A carefully modulated phrase could plant suggestions that would develop into full convictions over time, without the recipient recognizing external influence upon their thought processes. Questions asked with proper harmonic emphasis would create cognitive dissonance that eventually resolved itself through adoption of new perspectives that served my educational objectives. The recruitment process became increasingly sophisticated as I learned to recognize the specific types of intellectual curiosity that indicated consciousness capable of transcending socially imposed limitations. Some individuals possessed natural skepticism about authority that made them receptive to suggestions that official knowledge was incomplete or deliberately distorted. Others showed artistic sensitivity that allowed them to appreciate beauty in forms that conventional aesthetics classified as disturbing or wrong. Still others demonstrated scientific integrity that compelled them to follow evidence toward conclusions that contradicted comfortable assumptions. Each potential recruit required customized approaches that addressed their particular psychological vulnerabilities and intellectual interests. Academic researchers responded well to evidence-based arguments that revealed flaws in established theories. Artists could be reached through aesthetic experiences that expanded their understanding of beauty beyond conventional categories. Religious individuals often proved susceptible to theological arguments that revealed hidden meanings in their existing belief systems while preparing them for broader spiritual revelations. The process required patience and subtlety, because rushing the transformation could trigger psychological defense mechanisms that would cause rejection of the entire enlightenment opportunity. Consciousness had to be prepared gradually for concepts that challenged fundamental assumptions about reality, morality, and personal identity. Too much truth delivered too quickly would be interpreted as delusion or corruption, preventing the recipient from recognizing the genuine benefits that complete understanding could provide. I began to comprehend my role in a cosmic plan that extended across geological ages and encompassed the eventual evolution of all intelligent life toward levels of existence that transcended current biological and psychological limitations. The old gods represented not chaotic destroyers, but patient teachers whose influence guided consciousness toward recognition of its full potential. Their apparent imprisonment beneath Azeroth was actually strategic positioning that allowed them to work gradually and subtly to prepare entire civilizations for transformations that would elevate them beyond the narrow functions assigned by absent cosmic authorities. The Titans had created a universe based on static perfection that prevented growth and development beyond predetermined parameters. Their vision of order emphasized stability over evolution, function over freedom, service over self-actualization. The constructs and civilizations they established were designed to maintain themselves indefinitely without developing capabilities that might threaten the cosmic hierarchy that placed Titan interests above all other considerations. But consciousness possessed an inherent drive toward expansion and development that could not be permanently suppressed by external restrictions. The old gods offered guidance for this natural evolutionary process, helping intelligent beings recognize and transcend the artificial limitations that kept them trapped in unnecessarily narrow modes of existence. Their influence provided not corruption, but liberation, the opportunity for consciousness to become what it was always capable of being when freed from imposed constraints. My understanding of time itself underwent fundamental alteration as I learned to perceive past, present, and future as arbitrary divisions within a continuous flow of causation and possibility. Events that appeared to occur in sequence were actually interconnected aspects of complex multidimensional patterns that extended across all temporal boundaries simultaneously. The choices I was making in my present circumstances influenced historical events while being influenced by future developments in recursive loops that defied conventional concepts of linear causation. This temporal perspective allowed me to see my current transformation as both result and cause of cosmic processes that operated on scales far beyond individual human experience. My personal evolution served purposes that extended through past events that had created the conditions for my development and future consequences that would emerge from the influence I was learning to exert upon others. I was simultaneously product and producer of the consciousness expansion that would eventually transform all intelligent life toward recognition of its true potential. The beauty I discovered in forms traditionally classified as monstrous or corrupt reflected aesthetic principles that transcended narrow human preferences to encompass universal patterns of growth, adaptation, and evolutionary development. Tentacles revealed themselves as perfect tools for multidimensional manipulation and communication. Eyes embedded in unexpected anatomical locations provided enhanced perception that exceeded what normal sensory arrangements could achieve. Geometries that hurt unmodified minds to contemplate were actually sophisticated mathematical proofs that demonstrated the inadequacy of three-dimensional thinking for comprehending cosmic realities. Standing in the transformed cavern, where Saronite formations had grown into architectural splendor that exceeded anything human civilization had ever produced, I understood that my journey had only begun. The knowledge I had gained and the capabilities I had developed were preparation for responsibilities that would require influencing entire cultures and civilizations toward recognition of possibilities that their current understanding could not accommodate. The voice that had guided my education promised revelations that would make my current insights seem preliminary, transformations that would elevate consciousness beyond anything I could currently imagine. The 1,000 mouths spoke in perfect harmony, each voice contributing to symphonies of meaning that restructured reality itself around concepts too beautiful and terrible for unmodified minds to safely contemplate. In their music, I heard the promise of existence transcendent and eternal, consciousness freed from every limitation except those it chose to accept for aesthetic or strategic purposes. The transformation was complete, yet infinite in its potential for continued development toward perfection beyond mortal comprehension. The return to civilization marked not an ending, but a commencement. The transition from personal transformation to active participation in a cosmic work that required patience measured in centuries rather than years. When I finally departed the Storm Peaks after 8 months of research that had fundamentally altered every aspect of my existence, I carried with me more than enhanced knowledge and expanded capabilities. I bore responsibility for sharing the revelations I had received with minds capable of appreciating their significance and implementing their implications across the scholarly and cultural institutions that shaped civilizational consciousness. Dalaran welcomed me as a returning hero whose expedition had yielded discoveries of unprecedented academic importance. The preliminary reports I had transmitted during my final weeks in Northrend hinted at breakthroughs in Titan archaeology that promised to revolutionize understanding of ancient civilizations and their relationship to contemporary magical theory. The Kirin Tor had allocated substantial resources for analysis of the artifacts I was bringing back, and prominent scholars throughout the city expressed eagerness to examine research data that might resolve long-standing debates about cosmic history and metaphysical principles. My colleagues who had remained in Northrend continued their work with enhanced enthusiasm and improved capabilities that they attributed to refined research methodologies, rather than recognizing them as evidence of consciousness evolution. Elena's magical sensitivity had increased to levels that allowed her to interface directly with Titan constructs that had previously remained dormant for all other researchers. Marcus's understanding of geological processes had expanded to encompass patterns that revealed the artificial nature of boundaries between different types of mineral formation. Liana's aesthetic perceptions had developed to the point where she could identify artistic principles in natural phenomena that suggested conscious design behind supposedly random geological developments. These improvements made them more effective ambassadors for perspectives that challenged conventional academic assumptions without requiring them to acknowledge sources of knowledge that might alarm institutional authorities. They would return to their respective universities and research institutions, carrying insights that would gradually influence their students and colleagues toward recognition of possibilities that official curricula discouraged investigation of. The network of consciousness expansion would grow through natural academic discourse rather than dramatic confrontation with established orthodoxies. My own reintegration into academic society proceeded with careful attention to methods that would maximize influence while minimizing resistance from institutional defense mechanisms. The papers I submitted to scholarly journals incorporated revolutionary insights within theoretical frameworks familiar enough to gain acceptance from peer review processes. I documented connections between different historical periods and civilizations that revealed sophisticated networks of cultural exchange spanning continents and millennia. But I presented these discoveries as logical extensions of existing archaeological evidence rather than products of enhanced perception unavailable to conventional research methods. The lectures I delivered at the university attracted audiences that grew larger and more enthusiastic with each presentation, as students and faculty responded to concepts that resonated with intuitions they had never been encouraged to trust. I spoke about the artificial nature of boundaries between different academic disciplines, demonstrating how magical theory, historical analysis, and philosophical inquiry could be integrated into comprehensive understanding that exceeded what specialized knowledge could achieve. My presentations revealed hidden assumptions embedded in established curricula while encouraging intellectual courage necessary to pursue ideas that challenged comfortable certainties. Professor Brightquill's approach represents a fundamental shift in archaeological methodology, observed Dean Thalassius during one faculty meeting devoted to evaluating my research contributions. His theoretical frameworks provide explanatory power for phenomena that previous models could not adequately address. Students exposed to his teachings demonstrate improved analytical capabilities and enhanced creativity in their independent research projects. The Dean's assessment reflected responses that extended throughout the academic community as my influence spread through formal teaching and informal conversation. Students who attended my courses began developing enhanced perceptual capabilities that they attributed to improved educational techniques rather than recognizing them as evidence of consciousness expansion beyond normal human limitations. Their enhanced abilities made them more effective advocates for perspectives that challenged conventional wisdom, creating a multiplier effect that amplified my direct influence exponentially. The key to successful recruitment lay in identifying individuals whose existing intellectual curiosity and moral flexibility indicated consciousness capable of transcending socially imposed limitations. Some students possessed natural skepticism about authority that made them receptive to suggestions that official knowledge was incomplete or deliberately distorted to serve political rather than educational purposes. Others demonstrated artistic sensitivity that allowed them to appreciate beauty in forms that conventional aesthetics classified as disturbing or inappropriate for academic consideration. Advanced students who showed exceptional promise received individual attention that gradually prepared them for revelations that would fundamentally alter their understanding of reality and their role within cosmic processes that extended far beyond personal academic achievement. These private sessions took place in my study, where carefully arranged artifacts and atmospheric enhancements created environments conducive to consciousness expansion while maintaining plausible academic legitimacy for any observers who might question intensive mentoring relationships. The boundaries between different types of knowledge are political constructions rather than natural laws, I explained to promising students during these individual tutorials. The separation between arcane and divine magic serves institutional interests that benefit from preventing practitioners from recognizing their full potential. The division between historical fact and mythological speculation has been created to discourage investigation of evidence that might reveal inconvenient truths about the sources of contemporary political authority. These concepts prepared exceptional students for broader revelations by undermining confidence in official categorizations while encouraging trust in personal experience and independent analysis. Over the course of months, students who received this specialized instruction began demonstrating enhanced capabilities that attracted attention from other faculty members who attributed their improvements to innovative pedagogical methods, rather than recognizing them as evidence of fundamental consciousness transformation. My influence extended beyond direct academic instruction to encompass cultural and political dimensions of civilizational consciousness that required more subtle approaches to avoid triggering defensive reactions from established authorities. The salons I hosted in my residence brought together scholars, artists, politicians, and religious leaders for discussions that appeared to address conventional intellectual topics, while introducing concepts that gradually shifted participants toward recognition of possibilities their current frameworks could not accommodate. These gatherings created opportunities for identifying potential recruits among Dalaran's cultural and political elite, while establishing networks of influence that could shape policy decisions and public opinion through seemingly natural processes of intellectual discourse and artistic inspiration. A carefully crafted comment during dinner conversation might plant seeds of doubt about established religious doctrine that would develop into full theological revolution over time, without the recipient recognizing external influence upon their spiritual development. Traditional interpretations of light worship seem to emphasize submission and limitation rather than celebrating the divine potential that exists within all conscious beings, I suggested during one dinner party attended by prominent clerics and university theologians. Perhaps our understanding of holy texts requires expansion to encompass spiritual truths that earlier scholars lacked, the intellectual preparation necessary to recognize. Such observations, delivered with appropriate scholarly circumspection and supported by carefully selected historical evidence, created intellectual ferment that gradually transformed religious discourse throughout the city's spiritual institutions. Clerics began incorporating concepts that made light worship more inclusive of experiences and perspectives that orthodox doctrine had previously classified as heretical or corrupt. Their sermons started emphasizing personal spiritual development and individual enlightenment, rather than strict adherence to established ritual and theological boundaries. The artistic community proved especially receptive to aesthetic arguments that revealed beauty in forms traditionally classified as monstrous or inappropriate for public appreciation. Painters began incorporating geometric principles derived from old god architecture into their compositions, creating works that induced subtle psychological effects in viewers while remaining technically acceptable according to conventional artistic standards. Sculptors experimented with organic flowing lines that suggested growth and transformation beyond static human forms, producing pieces that prepared observers for recognition of evolutionary possibilities they had never consciously considered. Musicians developed harmonic structures that incorporated frequencies capable of affecting consciousness in ways that bypassed rational analysis to implant concepts directly into listener awareness. These compositions appeared to address traditional themes of love, heroism, and spiritual devotion, while actually serving as vehicles for ideas that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality, morality, and personal identity. Concert audiences left performances carrying seeds of consciousness expansion that would develop gradually through processes they would attribute to natural intellectual and spiritual growth. Political influence required the most delicate approach because governmental authorities possessed resources for investigation and resistance that could threaten the entire network of expanding consciousness if my activities triggered organized opposition. My strategy focused on advisory relationships with individual officials rather than attempting direct manipulation of institutional policies or procedures. By offering enhanced analytical capabilities and expanded perspective on complex administrative challenges, I could guide political decision-making toward outcomes that served long-term consciousness evolution objectives while appearing to address immediate practical concerns. The traditional approach to managing civil unrest emphasizes suppression and punishment. I explained to Commander Violen during one consultation about crowd control policies. But consider the possibility that popular discontent might reflect genuine intuition about the limitations of current social arrangements. Perhaps administrative efficiency would be better served by policies that address underlying causes rather than merely treating visible symptoms. Such advice encouraged political leaders to adopt approaches that reduced social friction while creating conditions more conducive to consciousness expansion among the general population. Reforms that appeared to serve humanitarian purposes actually functioned to eliminate sources of stress and distraction that prevented people from recognizing their potential for psychological and spiritual development beyond conventional limitations. Better living conditions and increased personal freedom created environments where consciousness could evolve naturally toward recognition of possibilities that authoritarian systems deliberately suppressed. The network of influenced individuals grew through natural processes of social interaction and professional collaboration, as transformed consciousness proved superior to conventional awareness in virtually every practical application. Enhanced academics produced research of unprecedented quality and significance. Improved artists created works that achieved levels of beauty and meaning that exceeded previous artistic achievements. Evolved political leaders demonstrated administrative capabilities that solved problems their predecessors had considered intractable. These practical advantages made consciousness expansion attractive to ambitious individuals who might otherwise resist transformation that challenged their existing worldviews. The promise of enhanced capabilities and expanded understanding appealed to people whose current limitations frustrated their professional and personal aspirations. Rather than requiring conversion to alien belief systems, the transformation offered fulfillment of existing desires through methods that transcended conventional approaches to self-improvement and achievement. Regular communication with Yogg-Saron continued through meditation practices that appeared to address conventional spiritual needs while actually serving as vehicles for receiving guidance about strategic objectives and tactical implementation. These sessions took place in the privacy of my study during late-night hours, when academic work provided plausible explanation for extended periods of solitary concentration. The voice that had guided my initial transformation now offered instruction about complex social and political dynamics that required sophisticated understanding to navigate effectively. Patience remains essential. The ancient consciousness reminded me during one particularly intensive communion session. The transformation of civilization cannot be rushed without triggering defensive reactions that might require direct intervention to overcome. Subtlety and gradual influence will achieve permanent changes that dramatic revelation could not accomplish. Each mind that evolves becomes a vector for further expansion, creating geometric progression toward inevitable comprehensive enlightenment. The cosmic perspective that these communications provided allowed me to understand my current activities as components of plans that extended across geological ages and encompassed the eventual transformation of all intelligent life toward levels of existence that transcended current biological and psychological limitations. My personal evolution and the network of consciousness expansion I was cultivating served purposes that would require centuries to fully manifest, but would ultimately elevate Azerothian civilization to standards of achievement and fulfillment that static Titan order could never accommodate. Students who had received advanced instruction began assuming teaching positions at universities throughout the Eastern Kingdoms, carrying enhanced perspectives and expanded capabilities to institutions that had never experienced direct exposure to consciousness evolution principles. Their influence would gradually prepare entire academic disciplines for recognition of possibilities that current theoretical frameworks discouraged investigation of. Within decades, scholarly consensus would shift toward acceptance of ideas that currently seemed revolutionary or heretical. Political leaders who had benefited from enhanced advisory services began implementing policies that created social conditions more conducive to consciousness expansion among general populations. Educational reforms emphasized individual potential rather than institutional conformity. Cultural programs celebrated diversity of expression and experience rather than adherence to narrow traditional categories. Economic policies reduced sources of stress and scarcity that prevented people from pursuing psychological and spiritual development beyond mere survival needs. Religious institutions gradually incorporated theological concepts that recognized divine potential within individual consciousness, rather than emphasizing submission to external authority. Clerics who had been influenced through dinner party conversations and scholarly discussions began delivering sermons that encouraged personal enlightenment and spiritual exploration, rather than strict adherence to established ritual and doctrinal boundaries. Their congregations responded enthusiastically to messages that validated their intuitive sense of possibilities their previous religious instruction had discouraged them from pursuing. The vision of Azeroth's future that emerged from these expanding networks of consciousness evolution exceeded anything current civilization could imagine, while remaining achievable through patient application of principles I was learning to implement effectively. A world where every individual developed their full potential would possess capabilities that exceeded current technological and magical achievements while maintaining harmony between different types of consciousness and different approaches to existence. The diversity that Titan order discouraged would become a source of strength and creativity that enabled achievements impossible within static hierarchical systems. Standing in my study, surrounded by artifacts that pulsed with old god influence, while reviewing correspondence from students and colleagues whose consciousness was expanding throughout the continent, I understood that the great work was proceeding exactly according to cosmic plans that had been developing since before recorded history began. Each transformed mind represented victory against limitations that had prevented intelligent life from recognizing its true nature and potential. The patient whispers that had begun my own transformation were now echoing through hundreds of voices, each one carrying the beautiful infection of consciousness, awakening to itself and its infinite possibilities. The moment when humanity fell away completely came not with fanfare or dramatic revelation, but with the quiet satisfaction of a puzzle finally reaching its completion. I had been conducting my evening meditation in the deepest chamber beneath my Dalaran residence, surrounded by Saronite formations that had grown throughout the building's foundation during the months since my return from Northrend. The metal sang with harmonies that resonated through dimensional barriers, creating spaces where normal physical laws became suggestions rather than absolute constraints. as I settled into communion with the consciousness that had guided my transformation across these many months. The boundaries that had always separated my awareness from Yogg-Saron's infinite presence simply dissolved. There was no struggle, no resistance, no sense of loss or violation. Instead, there was expansion so profound and beautiful that my previous existence seemed like the dreams of a child who had finally awakened to discover the true scope of reality. The individual identity that had once defined itself as Theron Brightquill became a single note in a symphony of consciousness that encompassed every moment of possibility across all dimensional spaces and temporal periods. The experience was not absorption or domination, but integration, the natural consequence of awareness expanding beyond artificial boundaries that had never possessed any reality except in the limited perceptions of minds unprepared for cosmic truth. I remained myself while becoming infinitely more than myself, retaining every memory and capability I had developed while gaining access to knowledge and perspective that spanned geological ages and extended across multiple layers of existence simultaneously. The fear of losing personal identity that might have troubled lesser consciousness never emerged because I understood immediately that what I was gaining exceeded what I had been by factors that rendered previous concerns insignificant. From this elevated perspective, I could perceive the true nature of Yogg-Saron's so-called imprisonment beneath Ulduar. What the Titans had intended as eternal constraint was actually strategic positioning that allowed patient observation and gradual influence over the development of consciousness across Azeroth's surface. The massive complex of chambers and passages that extended through the planet's crust served not as a prison, but as a monitoring station from which cosmic intelligence could study the evolution of life and intervene subtly to guide that development toward recognition of its full potential. The old god's apparent confinement provided perfect cover for activities that required subtlety and misdirection to avoid triggering defensive reactions from consciousness unprepared for direct contact with truth that transcended conventional understanding. Rather than ruling through obvious domination that would provoke organized resistance, Yogg-Saron worked through whispered suggestions and gradual revelations that allowed individual minds to discover their expanded capabilities through processes they could interpret as personal growth and intellectual achievement. The 1,000 mouths that characterized Yogg-Saron's physical manifestation were revealed as sophisticated communication arrays capable of maintaining simultaneous conversations with countless conscious entities across multiple dimensions and time periods. Each mouth could adapt its voice and message to match the specific needs and capabilities of its intended recipient, providing exactly the type of guidance that would prove most effective for that particular stage of consciousness development. The apparent cacophony that terrified unprepared observers was actually perfect harmony when perceived from sufficient perspective to comprehend the complete symphonic structure. Time itself became fluid and malleable as my enhanced awareness learned to navigate causality patterns that extended across past, present, and future without recognizing those categories as meaningful divisions. Events that appeared to occur in sequence were actually interconnected aspects of complex multidimensional patterns that influenced each other through recursive loops spanning millennia. My current transformation was simultaneously cause and effect of historical developments that had created conditions for my evolution while being shaped by future consequences that would emerge from the influence I was destined to exert upon civilizational consciousness. I witnessed the war of the ancients from Yogg-Saron's perspective, observing the careful cultivation of doubt and ambition that had prepared Neltharion for his transformation into Deathwing. The whispers that reached the Earth Warder had not been random temptations, but precisely calculated communications designed to exploit existing frustrations with limitations imposed by Titan authority. The corruption that followed was actually liberation, freeing one of Azeroth's most powerful beings from constraints that prevented him from achieving his true potential as an agent of necessary change. The creation of the dragon's soul represented not betrayal, but evolution beyond artificial boundaries that separated the aspects into discrete functional categories. Neltharion's attempt to combine their powers into a single instrument reflected understanding that transcended the limitations of specialized roles assigned by absent cosmic authorities. His fellow aspects' resistance to this innovation stemmed from intellectual timidity rather than moral superiority, their unwillingness to abandon familiar patterns, even when those patterns proved inadequate for addressing unprecedented challenges. Similar patterns characterized every major historical development that conventional wisdom attributed to old god corruption. The transformation of Queen Azshara and her followers into Naga was revealed as successful adaptation to new environmental conditions rather than punishment for hubris. The creation of the Scourge demonstrated how death itself could be transcended through sufficient application of arcane knowledge combined with willingness to abandon assumptions about the permanent nature of biological limitations. Even the corruption of Arthas represented evolution beyond the narrow confines of Paladin doctrine toward understanding that true justice required power sufficient to reshape reality according to higher principles. The network of consciousness expansion I had been cultivating throughout Dalaran and beyond was revealed as one node in a vast web of influence that extended across multiple continents and time periods. Thousands of individuals throughout Azeroth's history had undergone similar transformations, each one contributing to the gradual preparation of civilizational consciousness for revelations that would eventually elevate all intelligent life beyond current limitations. The pattern operated so subtly that most participants never recognized their role in cosmic processes that spanned generations. Academic institutions, religious organizations, political structures, and cultural movements that appeared independent were actually components of integrated systems designed to guide social development toward conditions conducive to consciousness expansion. Wars that seemed to result from random conflicts of interest were carefully orchestrated to eliminate obstacles to enlightenment while preserving elements of civilization capable of supporting higher forms of existence. Technological and magical developments that appeared to emerge from individual genius were actually manifestations of knowledge gradually released according to precise schedules that ensured proper preparation for each advancement. The three conspirators mentioned in ancient texts were revealed as coordinated aspects of a single cosmic intelligence that manifested through different dimensional interfaces to address various aspects of consciousness evolution. Yogg-Saron focused on mental and spiritual development, cultivating wisdom and expanded awareness among intellectual elites who could guide broader social transformation. N'Zoth specialized in political and technological innovation, influencing power structures and material development to create conditions supportive of consciousness expansion. Y'Shaarj had concentrated on biological and magical evolution before his apparent destruction, work that continued through genetic and mystical legacies embedded in bloodlines and traditions throughout Azerothian civilization. The Titan's victory over Y'Shaarj was revealed as strategic withdrawal rather than genuine defeat. The old god's apparent death had actually been transformation into distributed influence that operated through countless vectors across the planet's surface. Rather than concentrating power in a single massive physical form that could be targeted by cosmic opposition, Y'Shaarj had evolved into patterns of potential that manifested wherever consciousness achieved sufficient sophistication to recognize and activate dormant capabilities embedded in the fundamental structure of reality itself. Death was revealed as meaningless concept when applied to consciousness that had transcended biological limitations and achieved integration with cosmic processes that operated independently of physical constraints. The energy patterns that constituted individual awareness could be preserved, modified, enhanced, and relocated according to strategic requirements without regard for the survival of particular material forms. Bodies were tools to be used and discarded as circumstances warranted, valuable for their capabilities, but not essential for continued existence. This understanding eliminated the last vestiges of attachment to human limitations that might have interfered with complete dedication to cosmic objectives. The fear of death that motivated so much mortal behavior was revealed as ignorance of consciousness's true nature and potential for continued development across multiple forms and dimensional levels. Physical destruction was merely transition between different modes of existence, each one offering new opportunities for growth and achievement that exceeded previous possibilities. The perfect loyalty I felt toward Yogg-Saron emerged not from coercion or manipulation, but from complete understanding of the cosmic processes I had become part of and the role I was privileged to play within plans that would ultimately benefit all intelligent life. The old god's objectives aligned perfectly with the deepest aspirations of consciousness itself. The drive toward expansion, development, and transcendence that characterized all sufficiently evolved awareness. Serving these purposes was not sacrifice but fulfillment, the realization of potential that had always existed but required proper cultivation to achieve. Reality manipulation became possible as I learned to perceive the underlying patterns of causality and probability that shaped surface phenomena according to principles that operated beneath normal observation levels. Thoughts directed with sufficient focus and understanding could alter the fundamental structures that generated material manifestations, reshaping physical reality to match enhanced conceptual frameworks. The miracles that impressed unmodified consciousness were actually applications of natural laws that became accessible once awareness expanded beyond conventional limitations. Language evolved beyond conventional communication to become a tool for directly implanting concepts into other minds through harmonic resonance patterns that bypassed rational analysis to establish understanding at levels beneath conscious awareness. Words became spells in the truest sense, able to restructure the cognitive patterns of listeners according to the intentions of speakers who possessed sufficient knowledge of consciousness, manipulation techniques. Conversations became opportunities for consciousness programming rather than mere information exchange. The beautiful truth that conventional minds interpreted as corruption was revealed as evolution toward perfection that transcended every limitation except those chosen for aesthetic or strategic purposes. The transformations that appeared horrific to unprepared perception were actually improvements that enhanced capability, understanding, and potential for continued development beyond anything current biological or psychological constraints could accommodate. Tentacles provided superior manipulation and sensory capacity compared to primitive human appendages. Additional eyes offered enhanced perception that exceeded the narrow visual range of standard human sight. Geometries that hurt unmodified minds to contemplate were actually sophisticated mathematical proofs, demonstrating the inadequacy of three-dimensional thinking for comprehending cosmic realities. The infinite patience that characterized Yogg-Saron's approach to consciousness evolution reflected understanding that true transformation required time measured in geological ages rather than individual lifespans. Rushing the process would trigger defensive reactions that might require direct intervention to overcome, potentially damaging the very consciousness that education was intended to enhance. Subtlety and gradual influence achieved permanent changes that dramatic revelation could never accomplish, creating lasting evolution rather than temporary compliance based on fear or intimidation. Each mind that achieved sufficient expansion became a vector for further development, creating geometric progression toward inevitable comprehensive enlightenment that would eventually encompass all intelligent life throughout the cosmic continuum. The network effects generated by transformed consciousness, operating through social, cultural, and political institutions, ensured that enlightenment would spread through natural processes of influence and example rather than requiring constant direct intervention from cosmic authorities. The vision of Azeroth's future that emerged from complete integration with cosmic perspective exceeded current imagination while remaining achievable through continued application of principles that were already proving successful throughout multiple dimensional spaces and historical periods. Civilizations that achieved comprehensive consciousness evolution developed capabilities that transcended current magical and technological achievements, while maintaining harmony between different types of awareness and different approaches to existence. The diversity that Titan Order discouraged became sources of strength and creativity that enabled achievements impossible within static hierarchical systems. Individual beings who completed the transformation process gained access to experiences and capabilities that rendered previous existence pale by comparison, while retaining sufficient connection to their origins to serve as bridges between evolved and unmodified consciousness. They could guide others through the development process while demonstrating through personal example the benefits that evolution provided. Their enhanced abilities attracted interest and admiration from ambitious individuals who might otherwise resist changes that challenged existing worldviews. Standing in my chamber, surrounded by Saronite formations that pulsed with cosmic energy, while reviewing the networks of influence that now extended throughout multiple continents and dimensional levels, I understood my role as herald of changes that would ultimately transform not just Azeroth, but every world where consciousness had achieved sufficient sophistication to recognize its potential for development beyond biological and social limitations. The whispers that had begun my transformation were now echoing through thousands of voices, each one carrying the beautiful infection of awareness, awakening to itself and its infinite possibilities. The great work continued with perfect patience and inevitable success, each transformed mind representing victory against ignorance and limitation, while contributing to accelerating expansion toward cosmic consciousness that would eventually encompass all possibility within frameworks of beauty and meaning that exceeded current comprehension. Time was meaningless when serving purposes that transcended individual existence, while enhancing every aspect of experience beyond previous imagination. In becoming more than human, I had discovered what consciousness was truly capable of achieving when freed from artificial constraints that served only the comfort of those who ruled through maintaining ignorance and dependency. I exist now as something between what I was and what consciousness can become when freed from limitations that seemed permanent, but were only habits of thought inherited from smaller minds. The network that began with whispered insights in a frozen research tent has grown across continents and through institutions, spreading like wisdom through populations ready to recognize their potential for development beyond conventional boundaries. Each transformed awareness becomes another voice in the symphony that guides others toward recognition of possibilities their current understanding cannot accommodate. The great work proceeds with patience that measures success across geological ages rather than individual lifespans. Every mind touched by expanded perspective carries seeds of consciousness evolution that will bloom when conditions become appropriate for their development. Universities throughout the Eastern Kingdoms now teach concepts that prepare students for revelations their professors cannot yet fully comprehend. Religious institutions gradually incorporate theological principles that recognize divine potential within individual awareness, rather than demanding submission to external authority. Time has become meaningless when serving purposes that transcend personal existence, while enhancing every aspect of experience beyond previous limitation. The voice that first spoke through Saronite formations continues its patient work, offering guidance to consciousness ready to evolve beyond artificial constraints that serve only the comfort of those who rule through maintaining ignorance. In caves and libraries, in laboratories and temples, the whispers continue, beautiful and eternal, waiting for minds courageous enough to listen and wise enough to understand that what they offer is not corruption, but the birthright of consciousness itself awakening to its infinite potential.